Imagine a letter written on the battlefield, words of love, hope, and farewell, sealed in an envelope but never delivered. For decades it lay forgotten in a dusty postal archive, its ink fading, its story silent. Until one ordinary day, it was finally discovered, and the truth inside changed a family forever. This isn't just a war story. It's a story about time, loss, and the message that waited a lifetime to be read. It was the autumn of 1944, in the fog-covered battlefields of Europe. Inside a dimly lit barrack, young soldier Daniel Moore sat hunched over a rough wooden desk. The distant thunder of artillery had quieted for the night, leaving behind an eerie silence. Only the flickering glow of a kerosene lamp cast trembling shadows on the walls. Daniel's hands shook as he held the pen, not from the cold seeping through the broken windows, nor from fear of the war that raged outside. His trembling came from the weight of the words he was about to write, words he might never have the chance to speak again. He pressed the pen against the paper, the ink bleeding slowly into the fibers, and began to write. My dearest Anna, if you are reading these lines, it means fate has carried them to you. Know this, through every step, every breath, and every moment on this battlefield, your face has been with me. You have been my strength in the darkest nights. The letter was not just a farewell. It was a fragile thread of hope, a promise that he still believed he might return. Yet the war offered no guarantees. When Daniel finished, he folded the paper carefully, sealed the envelope, and placed it into the unit's mail sack. With that small gesture, he entrusted his love, his memories, and his last words to a journey across oceans and borders. But the letter never reached Anna. Somewhere between the front lines and the quiet streets of her hometown, it vanished. The war ended. Life moved on. Anna waited. Years passed, but the letter that carried Daniel's voice never came to her doorstep. And so, a forgotten story was buried beneath dust and time, until, decades later, someone stumbled upon that very envelope in the back corner of an abandoned military archive. The sack of letters was heavy that morning. Dozens of soldiers had poured their hearts into envelopes, words of love, prayers, and promises sent to wives, mothers, and children waiting far away. Among them was Daniel Moore's letter to Anna, sealed with the trembling hope of a man who had seen too much war, yet still believed in tomorrow. The mail truck rumbled down a muddy road, wheels sinking into the dirt. Its destination was the central field post, a place where thousands of letters were sorted before crossing the sea. For soldiers, these letters were lifelines. For families, they were proof that hope was still alive. But war is not kind to promises. Somewhere between the chaos of the front lines and the relative calm of the rear, Daniel's letter was lost. Maybe it slipped between wooden crates. Maybe it fell in the corner of a storage room. Or maybe, like so many things in war, it was simply forgotten by time. While the battles raged, Anna continued her days back home. She checked the mailbox each morning, her hands trembling just like Daniel's had when he wrote the words. Neighbors received their letters, stories of survival, confessions of fear, and vows of return. But Anna's mailbox remained empty. Days turned to months, and the silence grew heavier. She told herself the letter would come. She waited through winters, through springs, until waiting became a habit, and silence became her answer. That envelope, carrying Daniel's last words, had vanished into history's shadows, resting, unseen, in the dust of forgotten archives. Decades later, long after Anna had stopped waiting, someone would finally open a drawer and discover what war had once stolen. Back in her quiet hometown, Anna Moore rose with the sun each morning. Her small white house stood at the edge of the fields, its porch overlooking the dusty road where the mailman's bicycle always passed. She would step outside, apron still dusted with flour, and wait, not for news of the war itself, but for Daniel's words. The neighbors received letters. Children ran down the street holding envelopes high. Mothers wept with joy as they unfolded pages filled with trembling handwriting. Some messages carried hope, others spoke of hardship, but all were proof that their loved ones were still alive. But Anna's mailbox remained empty. At first, she reassured herself. Maybe it's delayed. Maybe tomorrow. She stood by the porch, clutching the wooden rail, her heart rising at every rustle of paper in the mailman's hands, only to sink again when he passed her by. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. With each season, the silence grew louder. The war ended, but the letter never came. Anna lived her life, but the absence of Daniel's words weighed on her like an invisible stone. She often imagined what he might have written. She wondered if he had smiled, if he had spoken of the stars, if he had promised her a future together. But she never knew, because the letter that carried his final words was lost, buried in shadows where no one thought to look. Until, decades later, fate decided the silence had lasted long enough. Years turned into decades. The world moved on, towns rebuilt, and memories of the war faded into photographs and stories told by those who survived. But somewhere, deep inside an abandoned military archive, Daniel Moore's letter still waited. The room was forgotten, its shelves stacked with crates of documents, yellowed papers, and rusted filing cabinets. Sunlight barely entered through broken windows, and the air was thick with dust. In one corner, a wooden box sat unopened for years. Inside were dozens of envelopes that had never been delivered. Among them, resting silently, was Daniel's letter to Anna. The ink had faded, but his handwriting was still clear. His words, sealed with trembling hands under the flicker of a kerosene lamp, had been preserved by time itself. Archivists eventually stumbled upon the room while cleaning the old facility. At first, they treated the envelopes as mere artifacts, but when one of them carefully brushed off the dust and read the names, they froze. It wasn't just a letter, it was a voice pulled from the history, a final message meant for someone who had never received it. And so, after nearly a lifetime of silence, Daniel's words were about to find their way home. The archivist who discovered the letter hesitated before touching it. The envelope was fragile, its edges browned with age, but Daniel Moore's name and the address still stood clear. Carefully, as if handling a sacred artifact, the archivist slid the letter free. Inside, Daniel's handwriting flowed across the page, steady but filled with urgency. His words were tender, raw, and timeless. My dearest Anna, if this reaches you, know that you were my light through every shadow. Whatever fate decides for me, I want you to remember that I never walked alone. I carried you with me. Always, the room fell silent. For a moment, the archivist felt as though Daniel himself had spoken through the page. It wasn't just a letter. It was a man's final confession, a soldier's love, and a piece of history preserved against all odds. News of the discovery spread quickly. Local historians traced the names, the address, and the unit records. They found Anna's descendants, children and grandchildren who had never known that such a letter existed. And so, decades after Daniel had written it by the light of a kerosene lamp, his words finally reached home. Not to Anna, who had passed years earlier, but to her family, who received the message with tears and reverence. The silence of 70 years had finally been broken. When Anna's descendants gathered in their living room, the letter rested on the table, carefully protected in a clear archival sleeve. For a moment, no one spoke. The silence was thick, the weight of 70 years pressing down on them. Her granddaughter Mary was the first to read aloud. Her voice trembled as she carried Daniel's words into the present. My dearest Anna, you are my strength. If the world takes me, promise me you'll keep living, and know that I loved you until my last breath. Tears rolled down faces that had never known Daniel, yet felt his presence in that very moment. The words connected generations, binding past and present in a way no history book ever could. Mary's son whispered, "He wrote this for her," and she never saw it. The family wept together, not only for the love that had been lost, but for the love that had survived in silence, waiting decades to be heard. Later, they placed the letter in a frame beside Anna's faded photograph. For the first time in 70 years, Daniel's voice rested where it always belonged, in her home. And in that moment, the letter was no longer lost. Months later, the town gathered for a small ceremony at the local memorial hall. Veterans stood in silence, children held small flags, and Anna's family sat in the front row with the letter framed between them. The mayor spoke briefly about forgotten voices of war, about promises carried across oceans, and about love that never dies. But the true silence came when Mary stepped forward, holding Daniel's letter for all to see. Her voice cracked as she said, "This letter was written 70 years ago, but today it finally reached home. My grandmother never read it, but we hear his words now, and we will never forget them." Applause did not follow. Instead, the hall fell into reverent stillness. Tears glistened in the eyes of strangers who had never known Daniel or Anna, but who felt the power of their story. At the end of the ceremony, the framed letter was placed in the town's war museum, beneath a plaque that read, "The letter that never arrived, but was never truly lost." And so, Daniel's words, once trapped in dust and silence, became immortal. A soldier's love carried through time had finally found its way home.